Hey everyone, happy World Listening Day 2024. Claude Schreier here in Ottawa, unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. So this is a special edition of the Conscient podcast, the bonus episode, called Listening to the Weave of Time. Which is also the theme of this year's World Listening Day. And World Listening Day takes place every year on July 18th, which is the day I published it. And July 18th, let me think, it's Murray Schafer's birthday. Oh, that's fun. The day is organized by the World Listening Project and is dedicated to understanding the world and its natural environments, societies, and cultures through the practice of listening. Speaking of listening, there's somebody in our house here using the bathroom, and I love the way sounds permeate recordings. So, my contribution to World Listening Day 2024 is excerpts from a few episodes from this 5th season of the Conscient podcast, which is dedicated to the exploration of art and the ecological crisis, though it has a lot of soundscape episodes because that's what I do and a lot of my friends, but it's very broad. But today I've curated those episodes this season that are more about listening and this notion of weaving time or weaving through time or into time or whatever the weaving of time might mean, could mean. And when I did a bit of research on the theme, I saw affinities between this idea of getting closer to nature, of reciprocity with the more than human world, with existing within nature. We are nature. That disconnect with nature that is so problematic, and the ongoing process of active listening, of deep listening, of so many types of listening, including decolonial listening, decolonized listening. So, let's start with episode 157, Sonic Research Group Part 1, and I'll explain a little bit. Every second Tuesday, Dr. Milena Drumeva at Simon Fraser University brings together a group of 15-20 sound researchers, sound studies professionals, students, people like me who are composers, and we talk about the field of sound studies. And I decided to record one of our sessions to share it with the listening community and the podcast community. And so we did it twice over a couple of months. And this is an excerpt from Hildegard Westerkamp, who many of you will know, who used to be part of the World Soundscape Project with Murray Schafer. And he lives in Vancouver and is still very active as a composer and writer and mentor and many other things. So this is what Hildy said.
The most interesting part to me is to discover what we're not listening to and why we're not doing that. And I think it's wonderful that I've had the chance to learn this listening from so early on, where you're trained to listen to the environment. And at that time, it was more about listening to the sounds of the environment and critiquing them, analyzing them, trying to understand them. To me, that subject has widened hugely and really has to do about listening in general and trying to understand why we are listening to things and why we're not listening to things. And so it becomes a political, social, cultural question on every level. And when a society, when society has crisis, it's often really good to observe what we really don't want to listen to, and who we are listening to and how we combine them. And I feel we are in a stage of real crisis right now. And that's why this subject matter, I think, has taken on great significance now.
I'll now move to my friend Terry Haran, who lives in Montreal and is a very accomplished composer and arts organizer and scholar and many other things. This is from episode 162, called An Ecological Lens. And we'll listen to 2 excerpts, and I think they are particularly interesting because they talk about music, but they're really kind of more openly talking about how we weave our way in the world.
I think as musicians we have particular concerns that perhaps looking at those through an ecological lens can be helpful. One of them is to think about the structures of funding which allow us to operate and to maybe reconsider them because they might change, and to be open to that change and to find solutions. And those solutions might be that we need to advocate for other kinds of support if we still want to advocate for support, or to engage in other types of activities to make a living. And maybe that sounds a little bit defeatist, but I'm trying to think in a very pragmatic way about what might be helpful and useful and create a greater sense of security and happiness in the future. The only thing that I can do is to try and live with as much integrity as I can and avoid participating in the things that I consider to be the least aligned with my values.
Here's part 2 of that sonic research group that I mentioned earlier. Now this one has a number of quotes or excerpts because the group, I was able to pull out one quote from each participant. So the first is by Milena Drumeva, who I mentioned earlier, and it's about sound walking, which is a practice that many of us do and is an ongoing way to weave our way in time.
It just, sound walking is always like magic. It is a magical experience. It is so simple, Hildy, as you said. And it is as much about listening to sounds or listening to absences of sound. It's not very typical in our lives. You know, we don't live the kinds of lives that require this kind of presence. And so it's so restorative for me and calms my spirit. But also it's such a reminder each and every time I do a sound walk of the power of just simply listening, opening up that register in all of its span from appreciation to analytics to criticality to spirituality.
Next is Jacek Smolitsky, who lives in Sweden but is originally from Poland. And we were talking about artificial intelligence, which comes back again and again in many of the conversations in my podcast this season. And I was particularly interested by his mention of the term historical consciousness, and how that is a form of weaving time.
Perhaps what differentiates us from the machines that we make is precisely that historical consciousness. Like, machines will never be able to be historically aware. we'll never be able to, to draw on historical context in order to evaluate the data that they work with, for instance, right? And I mean, we observe it a lot with how algorithms are operating using biased and skewed data without considering the context within which this data emerged. So I think our roles as educators is to be those kind of reminders of certain historical context from which the material that this whole machinery is digesting and using to produce futures comes from.
Many of you will have heard and met and worked with Barry Truax, who is a retired professor at Simon Fraser University and also an original member of the World Soundscape Project. And Barry does many things these days, including courses in composition and soundscape composition. And we talked a lot about education, and I really appreciated his connecting our need to further develop our listening abilities, but we've already come quite a long way in listening and sound education. So picking up on that, this is what Barry said.
Just to summarize, I think the process that has sustained us for so long is still valid, and we have to hope it can continue and become more developed, which is starting with oral awareness, then critical evaluation, and then the creation of alternatives, right? Whether they're doing less or doing different. It's a general pattern that has worked well for us in the past, and we just need to keep updating it and exploring it.
Another excerpt from Hildegard Westerkamp, this time about slowing down, which she also talked about in episode 22 of this podcast, way 3 years ago. And so Hildy, I think, says something interesting here about community and slowing down.
It has shown us that sound walking is grounding and connecting context, where when we do it in a group, the kind of magic that happens to listen together to something is this connection to community. It's almost as if a group becomes a community, even though we don't know each other from the start, and that it creates an atmosphere of willingness to be open. And so if we create, like Barry was talking about the educational context, if we create frameworks of that kind of listening, that's where hope can be, because we feel it inside ourselves, that grounding. And if we're connecting in that context to others, we can get to that energetic place because we've slowed down.
Last but not least, in this episode from the Sonic Research Group, Freya Zinoviev is completing a doctorate at Simon Fraser University and has specialized in a number of areas in and around extremist communications. Extremist in the sense of right-wing extremist. And she had this story that she shared with us at this session that I thought was, what can I say?
I don't know if anyone heard about a music teacher at Columbia recently who was teaching John Cage's 433. And they made a big fuss about how they couldn't teach that class because there was, in their words, the lusty chanting of protest outside the classroom. And all she could hear was "from the river to the sea." And she said, okay, this just means we can't teach this now because it's ruining 433. So we have to just continue reminding ourselves and others that listening is a community project, and we need to learn together how to listen to what is actually there.
Next is episode 174, Julie Andreev, More Than Human Creativity. And Julie teaches at the Emily Carr University of Art and Design in Vancouver, and is a prolific composer, sound artist, but also an excellent educator and organizer. And when I did the interview for the podcast with her, we were in Vancouver and talking about her relationship with more than humans. And it's a very interesting way, in fact, a very natural way to be with all of our other living beings when we take ourselves out of the centrality that we've given ourselves and live as equals with everyone and everything around us. Here's Julie.
And so as an artist and educator, I see that this moment really calls for a way of working through decolonization and forging a path of care. How I like to think of this is through multi-species communities, so that we're as humans, we're surrounded by more than human life, even in our urban environments. And so this path of care for our multi-species communities that make up the neighborhood, the community, and ultimately the earth is where I see a kind of my call for research and practice as an artist and educator.
Sabina Breitzemeter was in Ottawa for a few days, and I have known Sabina for a long time. Many of you listeners would know her as well. She teaches in Germany and is a very active listener and organizer and thought leader, I would say, on acoustic ecology. So this is from episode 175, An Aesthetic of Care. So we talked about a lot of things, and I recommend you listen to all of these episodes if you're so inclined. But this excerpt in particular from episode 175 caught my attention.
Of course, listening can teach us to appreciate our environment in a critical sense, but also in a kind of admiration for it. And if we admire something because we think it has a depth or it has a beauty or some interesting aspects, we want to keep it, we want to foster it.
2 more to go. Episode 178, Podium 2024, What More Can We Sing and Do, is a particularly important one for me because it was a panel at a large conference of choral singers and professionals in Canada that was held in Montreal in June. And I was asked to facilitate a panel on climate change and choral music. And so what you'll hear are 2 of the 4 panelists speaking about their thoughts on climate and choral music. First is Inuk singer and composer Diantha Edmonds.
It is taking far too long for us to acknowledge the damage we have done to the world's water and to Indigenous people, and to take action. Truth, reconciliation, change. Scientists have discovered that some whale songs actually evolve over time. It is my hope that the choirs who perform this work with me and all those who hear it will refuse to let what the whales are saying get lost in the ocean, and will join their song in calling for respect and reciprocity.
The second excerpt is from Elise Nakarato, who is the artistic director of the Myriad Ensemble, a choir based in Ontario. And this was from the very end of her presentation, and I think it's very good advice as we weave our way through time.
Provide. So I would say continue to stay humble, keep listening and keep learning. And that is how we will use choral music as a way to advocate and change the environmental crisis that we are facing ourselves in.
So last but not least, episode 180, Mary Edwards, capturing the beauty and terror of reality. I met Mary for the first time at the World Forum for Acoustic Ecology conference, Listening Pasts, Listening Futures, that was held at the Atlantic Center for the Arts in Florida in March of 2023, and I was one of the keynotes there, and I met Mary and heard some of her work and said to her, one day we should talk on my podcast. And so just a few weeks ago, we did. And there are two excerpts that really caught my attention from that conversation, and I'll play them for you now.
While we're not always on the same page, we're all going to be affected by the same outcome. And so when I went up to Svalbard, I went with the intention of also capturing the beauty that is, and the terror of, the reality of these changes and how they can be at once, fascinating to listen to, but also devastating to the environment. If you feel like listening is an inherent part of what I do, it's not just creating sound and music, but raising awareness around, if we listen more intently to our environment, we can understand the health of our environment.
Thank you for listening. You've been listening to a special episode of Conscient Podcast for the World Listening Days 2024, listening to the weave of time. I'd like to thank the World Listening Project team for putting this event on. It's much appreciated, and I think every year it grows and becomes something to look forward to. Thanks for listening.